All right. So recently I've been getting a lot of emails asking the question, if I had to choose only one and then fill in the blank, what would it be? And I think that might have to do with the recent video series comparing Ableton to Bitwig and the pros and cons of each one. And I'll be the first to admit that inside music production, there are so many options, it can be pretty overwhelming. Whether it's picking the right DAW or the right plugin, there's so much stuff out there, it's really hard to pick and choose what is the perfect right tool. However, recently someone asked me if I had to pick only one virtual synth, what would it be? And honestly, for me, that answer is really easy. It's VPS Avenger. Now, I've used VPS Avenger for a long time, and now with the release of version 2.0, I thought, what better time to make a video talking about how robust this plugin is and why, if I had to choose only one virtual synth to do everything inside all my sessions, it would easily be VPS Avenger. Now, before we jump over to the computer and check out all the amazing capabilities that Avenger has, let's just talk about who makes it, and it's a company called Vengeance Sounds. Now, if you're not familiar with Vengeance Sounds, they have been around for as long as I can actually remember being involved in electronic music production. You can look through their sample packs and hear samples that are just sprinkled throughout so many huge songs in electronic music. I actually have a vivid memory of when I was going through one of their sample packs and I heard a loop. And this is essentially the loop that was the entire track for Chris Brown's Turn Up the Music. It's like they just took the loop out of the pack, shoved it into a session, recorded some vocals on top of it, and called it a day. And a lot of the success of Vengeance Sounds has been the quality of the samples. They seem just to always work in the session, or the presets inside of Avenger, they always seem to be catchy, modern, and either just work right in the track, or they're a perfect starting place to kind of make a couple of tweaks and have a sound that really works. I think a lot of that has to do with the lead producer and sound designer over there, a guy named Manuel Chalice. If you go to their website and look under discography, you can just see this huge list of everything this guy has worked on. Amazingly talented dude that just seems to have the ear for what's catchy and what's going to be popular or what's currently popular. So a lot of the sounds out of Vengeance and VPS Avenger just seem to work right off the bat. Now, this video isn't going to be a super in-depth sound design course on how to use Avenger because that would be a really long masterclass style video, which we are currently working on. So if you want to see something like that, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and stay tuned. But for now, let's jump over into the computer, check out an overview of Avenger and what makes it so amazing, especially with some of the updates in version 2.0, and answer the question why, if I had to choose only one virtual synth, it would easily be VPS Avenger. All right, so here we are with Avenger pulled up on the screen, and what we're going to do is make our way from the upper left browser through the oscillators, the amp, the filter, the shaper, all the way down to the effects, the modulation, and then we're going to end up here in the center, because if you aren't impressed by the time we get to the center, you will be after we go over everything that's going on inside of here. Now, before we actually jump into each section and break it down, there's a couple of little tips I just want to sprinkle in here at the very beginning that really helped me get up and running with Avenger. The first thing is coming into System Preferences right here, and under Settings, we have this that says Show Tooltips. So if we turn that on, hit yes, then anytime we actually hover over a different knob or parameter, it's going to give us a little bit of a breakdown of what this knob or this parameter is actually doing. This helps just to understand what is happening behind the scenes within each one of these knobs. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn that off for this overview. But just so you know, you can come in here to System and then Settings and Show Tooltip, and that is where you're going to be able to find a very helpful feature to turn on. Another thing to note too is when you're looking at these knobs, if they do have a second gray circle within them, that is essentially a sub-function, and you're going to be able to see what it is down here at the bottom. So with level as an example, it says Oscillator 1 level, but then there's a little slash and it says the pan. So if I just click and move this, it's going to change the level. But if I right click, or if you're on a mouse or a trackpad and you two-finger click, you can then adjust whatever the sub function is. So if we want to reset this on a standard knob, just double click. but then if it is one of the sub functions, we're just going to double click with the right click enabled, and that will reset it. So you're going to see that periodically throughout all of these different knobs that have that gray inner circle. There is a sub function inside of that knob. Another thing to note too is anytime there is one of these gray boxes, there is a drop-down menu there. So anything like this is just a standard label, but if we come in here and click on FM, we're going to have a different drop-down menu where we have some options we can select. So anything that is one of these gray boxes, there is going to be some sort of drop-down menu, so get yourself familiar with this workflow. Another really cool thing inside of Avenger is that there is pretty much presets for almost everything. So let's just go into the mod envelope right here in the center, and anytime you see a series of lines, that means there's going to be some sort of presets that you're able to access right there. So this gives us the option to just save the preset or go to the folder, or right next to it we can click on this and we have a whole bunch of different presets, actually 152 shapes we can throw inside of this mod envelope and just come up with all these different crazy designs. And it's not just the presets inside of here. Pretty much anything inside of Avenger has some sort of presets that you can access. So as an example, coming over here to the master effects, or any one of these different effect stacks, there's actually a whole bunch of presets for different effects racks that you can quickly load in here to go through and see what they have. And then inside of each one of these effects, you're also going to be able to find a whole bunch of different presets here. So inside of Avenger, it is really handy to use these presets as a good starting point, and you can find some really creative stuff inside of there. Another thing to note too is that over here inside of the routing section, if you right click, it's going to actually have this big red highlight that shows you exactly where this is going. Another way to do that too is a single click and then the go to. It's actually going to show you exactly where this routing is going. The one cool thing about this too is it's going to switch you over into that tab. So let's say we're in step sequencer right here, and I wanted to jump to ARP real quick. I can just right click on that and it's going to change the screen and show me exactly where this routing is going. And one more thing inside of Avenger, we have the menu where we can init a patch and start from 0. And then also a really cool feature, which is simply just an undo button. So if we start moving a whole bunch of stuff around and find that we completely screwed up our patch, we can just step back through all those individual steps and get to where we left off. So with all that out of the way, let's start checking out everything inside of Avenger and what makes this my one and only go-to synth if I had to choose one and only one synth. Starting over here, we have the browser, which is pretty self-explanatory. You have the factory presets and all these different expansions, and if we click into it, we then have our different categories right here. But one thing that's really cool and new inside of Avenger 2.0 is preview. So just like inside of Nexus Synth, now when we click on something, it's going to give us a little bit of a preview of what we can expect when we load this in. I love this because it really saves a lot of time not having to load in each individual sound and then play a key to see what you're getting. The preview in here is awesome. Now, if you want to turn that preview on and off, there is a little music note right up here that just deactivates it. So now when I click on it, we're not hearing anything. But if I activate this, we are hearing that preview again. So now also inside of the browser, we do have the ability to favorite anything. We do have categories or alphabetic. We do have an info panel right here, which is sort of a tagging system, which allows us to tag. And then also we have a nice search feature in here. This is great so we can have some favorites set up, and we can also say, I want a bass that's a little bit aggressive, and it's going to start filtering out our results based on what each one of these is tagged as. So don't feel like you're constrained just to the standard way of working in this browser. Get into the search, and it really helps you refine down your search and find exactly what you are looking for inside of the browser. You also have a full files tab right here, which allows you to access any files on your hard drive. And this is really handy when we look over into the drum oscillator and the Trig, which essentially allow us to drop in samples directly from anywhere on our computer right inside of Avenger. And now let's move over to the right and check out the oscillator. Now, one theme that you're going to see reoccurring all the time inside of Avenger are these little plus buttons everywhere, because there's not just a single instance of anything pretty much inside of Avenger. It is extremely robust. So we are just going to do an overview of what's inside a single oscillator, but keep that in mind because you can add up to 8 oscillators and have all of these different features and functions inside of each one of these oscillators. So even that right off the bat, having those 8 oscillators, you can get some extremely complex patches going on. But when you see what you can do to those oscillators, you'll understand just exactly the immense power of VPS Avenger. So I'm just going to come in here and init this patch once again. Now, right here in the center, we have a visual representation of what's going on in the oscillator, but we can turn this oscillator into an immense amount of different kinds of synthesis. So if we click on saw right here, we see the bottom turns into a browser. And we have virtual analog shapes. We have freeform shapes that we're able to draw in. We have wavetables, resampling, which is similar to a wavetable, but you can load in these longer samples and then scrub through it and find little sections. You have granular synthesis. New in version 2.0, you have spectral synthesis. You also have single loops and multi-loops. So you can see right off the bat with a single oscillator, you have so many different kinds of synthesis that you can have each one of these oscillators executing. And it really unlocks Pandora's box of sound design once you get into adding multiple oscillators with all these different kinds of synths that you can have on each individual oscillator. So that is an oscillator, and to the sides of it, these are just different ways that we can actually tweak and manipulate the waveform that is inside of this oscillator. So as we start turning some of these knobs like X side, X format, bits is a bit reduction, we're going to start seeing it get a little granular. And down here at the bottom, we have the ability to add frequency modulation as well as amplitude modulation. And we do have drop-down menus with a whole bunch of different shapes that we can use for that modulation to feed into the shape that is inside of the oscillator here, both on the FM and the AM. Now moving over to the left, you have kind of your standard set of level and pan using that sub feature that we talked about earlier. We have transpose, we have fine tuning, and then also inside of that fine tuning is the random pitch, as we can see down here at the bottom when we hover over it. Then we actually have the ability to add noise. So instead of having to use a completely separate oscillator for noise, we can just add a layer of noise in there, and the sub function is going to be changing the color of the noise, so going from more of a pink to a white noise. Now moving over, we have our voicing tab. Now the voicing tab is very interesting. By default, with a mix all the way down to 0, we just have a single voice. However, this VSaw essentially is sort of a hyper saw or super saw, if you will. By default, it starts off at 4 voices, and as we turn up the mix, you're going to see the voices populate, and you're going to hear them as well. We can also adjust the detune. And we can go all the way up to 7 voices. So there we have a 7-voice super saw, but we can take it one step further by going over to the voicing. So voicing is actually going to add more layers of 7 additional voices that we can then change where they sit as far as how many semitones up and down. We can change the panning, we can change the volume of each one of those layers. So a very basic example would be going up 12 to have an octave, turning that on. And now we can hear that there's a full octave above that, 7 voices above. And we can also see that oscillator 1 now is coming out with 14 voices as opposed to 7 voices. So here's 7 voices. And now 14. We could take it a step further, and let's go in here and add a 7th. With 21 voices, and we can keep going and add 2 more layers. Another cool thing is that now we see we have these slashes, which means there's some sort of preset that we can access. So let's click and we have access to all these different chord structures right here. And since we are cranking out this VSaw with 7 voices on each layer, we're getting some pretty massive voicing going on. It might be getting a little chaotic, but it sounds absolutely huge. And we can take it one step farther by adding a sub-oscillator. So the sub-oscillator, the volume is right here, and you can select the shape and what octave it's hitting at. And if you're getting any sort of weird phase going on, you can even invert the phase of the sub-oscillator. So let's turn that on. And you should be hearing a little difference in volume while we're flipping the sub-oscillator phase in and out, because it's going to be changing the phase with all the different saws that are going on. So we could even bring some noise underneath that. And we start getting these massive, massive stacks. So that's just one oscillator. Again, we can have up to 8 of these oscillators, and each one of these oscillators can have a completely different synthesis engine running inside of it. So right there, you can start to see the immense possibilities just within the oscillator section alone. Now, we have 8 of these oscillators, but we also have 2 other oscillators in a sense. We have a drum oscillator and a trig section. So this drum oscillator, let's go ahead and solo this, is essentially a full-on drum machine inside of Avenger. So we have all of our different drum slots here. They're labeled accordingly. We have the ability to load in full drum kits right here. And what we see is all of the expansions that we have installed. We can go into any one of those expansions, load up a kit. It's going to load in that unique drum machine right here. We can even go back and then pick another, let's say Factory 2, and load in Deep Tech. And if we come down here to the center and go to the drum sequence, we can see that it actually loaded the corresponding drum sequence. Now I can lock this drum kit by clicking on that bright green lock, making it dim, meaning this drum kit is not going to change, but I can come over here and change the sequence. Now you can, if you want, come over here and just drag in your own samples just by simply, let's say, finding a clap, coming here and just dragging that right in. Now that clap is there. We can edit any one of these individual sounds by clicking on edit right here, and now we're down in the sample editor where we have any number of parameters. We have a whole amp envelope, we have a pitch envelope, we have the sample itself. We have the ability to change the pitch, the pan, a low pass, a high pass filter. So that is just to edit each one of these samples. Now on top of that, if we want to change out any of these sounds, what do we see? We see this little stack of lines, which means there must be access to a browser or a preset. So let's come into the bass drum, click on this, and what it's going to do, it's going to load in only the bass drum sounds from whatever expansion I have selected. So if I click all expansions, these are all the bass drums. And the cool thing is that when I come up here and select the browser for another sound, it's going to filter it based on what this actual slot is. So if I click on this for snares, it filters out all of my snares. Rim shots, only rim shots. So as you can see, it's doing half of the work for you by filtering out whatever you need to drop in this slot. So it will both work with the entire kit, but also with the sequence here. Now, one really cool thing that's new inside of version 2.0 is the ability to load loops. You can see right here that this already says loop. This is how we're going to turn on the loop. And if we come in here and click edit, we can see that it selects the drum loop for us. We have a whole bunch of different categories right here, so we can go through and check them out, and we can just load it right in. So now that we've loaded in our loop and we come to the bottom and look, we can see that the loop is actually extending and playing throughout the entirety of this drum sequence. Now we can shorten that up and come up with different variations. So essentially we're just starting it in different spots, or we can delete those out and just have the loop play through the entirety of this. So that is brand new in version 2.0, the ability to have loops down here inside of the drum sequence. Now, one little pro tip, when we're down here looking at the drum sequencer, if you select this second tool, which is the selection tool, which allows us just to select multiple notes, you can actually do a couple of sub-functions that aren't really apparent right off the start. So if we just select a couple notes, we can use our arrow keys to move them, both left, right, up, and down. We can also right-click and have everything going on in here, which is really cool. So let's just start off by clearing everything but keeping the kick. And then let's select this D right here, which happens to be a snare. And I'm just going to right-click and say fill in claps. And it automatically added it on the 2 and the 4, so when we play this back, and let's say we go up here to the open hi-hat and we want that filled all the way through. Instead of adding all those notes, we just right-click and say fill all. Now, inside of this drum machine, there's a couple more really cool things that you can do. One thing to note is that these parameters right here on the left, the velocity, the pan, the pitch, and the gate, those are independent for each single note. So let's say on this right here, I wanted the velocity a little bit lower. On this one right here, I wanted the velocity a little bit lower. On this guy right here, wanted the velocity lower. This one, velocity lower. So as you can see, while we're flipping through these, it's actually changing per each individual note. And also we're getting a visual representation of what's going on with the velocity by having it brighter or dimmer. We could even change, let's say, the panning for each individual one. And now when we play it back, we're getting a little bit of variety. So all of these, the velocity, the pan, the pitch, and the gate are all per individual note. And then this section right here actually allows you to do some really cool things with each note as well. So let's say we want a little hi-hat roll right here. Well, if we right-click on this, we can add some rolls for this note in particular. So if we add, let's say, 3, we also have these different options too. So you can have it, let's say, swell in. So there it is, swelling in. We could have it, let's say, doing 6 rolls. So as you can see, the drum oscillator inside of Avenger is a full-on drum machine. Now, next to the drum machine, we actually have the Trig. Now, the Trig essentially is 10 slots where we can load in different samples, and we have some pretty cool, unique things that we can do to them. Right off the bat, they're disabled, but we would want to turn it to note on or note off, either MIDI, CC, or macro button, depending on how we want to activate the sample that's loaded in. You do have a probability knob right here, which is awesome, meaning that it adds a random chance to when this will actually be fired. We have volume and pitch, but let's go ahead and load something in. So by hovering over the slot, we have the 3 lines on the left. So we know by clicking this, it's going to pull up the browser down below. So let's go ahead and load a sound into here. Sure, that's fine. And then let's make sure this is set to note on. And as you can hear, while we're playing this, it's actually pitching. And let's say we wanted to use this as a click at the beginning of a sound and we didn't want it to actually change pitch, we just wanted the root one. Well, we can come in here and hit edit and we can go to town tweaking this actual sample that's loaded into this slot. So we can adjust the envelope for the sample if we want to have more of an attack. We have a full pitch envelope inside of here. We also have key tracking. So let's go ahead and turn that key tracking down to 0. And now no matter where I hit on the keyboard, it is playing that note without adding any pitch, which is really handy if we want to use this as, let's say, the attack at the beginning of the sound. So just a really quick review of all the different ways we can generate sound inside of Avenger. We have 8 oscillators. Each one of these oscillators has all these different synth engines that can be loaded into it. And then we also have the drum oscillator where we can load in drum one-shots as well as full-on drum loops. We have a full drum sequencer where we can come up with different ideas. We can roll notes. We can add individual velocity to each one of those notes. We can change the full kit, the full sequence, and then we also have the Trig, which allows us to load 10 more samples with probability on each one of those, coming down into the editor and tweaking these individual samples however we want. So as you can see, with all the different ways of generating sound inside of Avenger, the possibilities are pretty much endless. But it becomes even more impressive once we start looking at how we were able to manipulate the sound through different envelopes, filters, and modulation and effects. So let's keep going. Over here to the right of the main oscillator, this is going to be the routing of where everything is going. So just to point out, this routing is for each one of these oscillators. The drum has its own routing, and the same with the Trig. It has its own routing as well. And inside of this routing, you're going to kind of start off with a standard setup. So let's take a look what that is. We have it going to the ARP, which is currently deactivated right now. We'd want to turn that on if we wanted the ARP. We have the pitch envelope, which is down here at the bottom. Right here is the pitch envelope. We have shaper, and shaper is right over here. And essentially what shaper is distortion on the oscillator level. And we'll cover that in a moment. Then moving down from there, we have it going to the filter. We have the amp envelope right there. Then we have it going to the send effects, which are going to be located over here. Again, we're going to cover all this as we go through Avenger. So what does all that mean? Well, let's take a look at it. So anytime we see a destination right here, we have to understand that there's a multitude of those destinations. As an example, when we look over here at the amp envelope and the filter envelope, we can have up to 5 of each one of these. We can have up to 5 shapers. We can have 8 arpeggiators. We can have 8 step sequencers. We can have 8 pitch envelopes. We can have 8 mod envelopes. It really is crazy how much stuff is inside of Avenger. But as an example, we're going to filter number 1 right here. But if we added multiple more filters, let's say 2, 3, and 4, we click on filter 1 and we can choose to send it to any one of those other filters right here. And that's the same with all the other destinations that have the ability to add more than one, which is pretty much everything inside of here. So let's say inside of the ARP, we had multiple ARPs. Then we could come up here to ARP 1 and we can see the option to go to any one of those 4 ARPs that we've just activated. And again, if you're confused about where this routing is going, let's say I have no idea what shaper is, I can just right click on it and it's going to show me exactly where I'm going. So moving our way down, it looks like we have S1 and S2. Well, what exactly are those? Let's right click on them and see where they go. They go over here to the effects send rack. So you can have up to 8 different effects in the send effects rack, and per oscillator send different amounts to each one of those effects. So as an example, if we would add, right click on here and add a different kind of reverb. Now we're asking ourselves, well, how do we actually route that over to it? Well, we got a couple of ways doing that. If we weren't using this AA verb at all, we could actually just click into it and say, I actually want this send to be going to VVerb. And now this is going over into VVerb. But if I wanted the AA verb at the same time, I could just come up here and add another destination out of my routing. So there it is right there, AA verb. And there we go. Now we have the ability to send this single oscillator to these 3 different effects found in the send effect rack right here. One thing to note is that you can reorder some of these. If you just click and hold on it, let's say the filter, I can put the filter before the shaper, which is adding the distortion. Or if I wanted that shaper distortion to go into the filter, I would simply click and drag it up. A couple things to note, if we wanted to turn off the routing to any one of these, it's just simply clicking the button right here, which turns that off. And if we want to change which one of the multiples that we're sending it to, we just click on it and go down and select that. And if we get confused and wondering where we're going with all of this, we can just right click on on it, and it will show us where that is, or we can click and hit go to. So that is essentially how we can route these individual oscillators to pretty much anything we want inside of Avenger. So let's take a look over here at the right side where we have our amp envelopes and our filter envelopes. We have 5 of the amp envelopes. We have 5 filters, each one with their own envelope at the bottom, and then also a master filter right here. So a couple of things to note when you're looking at these knobs. Cool thing is that whenever you touch and adjust it, you're actually going to get a visual pop-up with a representation of what's going on. And as we see inside the center, we have the gray sub feature. So when we click on that, we're going to see that we can actually start to curve the different parts of this envelope. I'm not going to go in and break down what every single thing does inside of the envelopes and everything else, because we will be covering that inside of future tutorials, but I just want to show you some of the highlight standout features. So now let's take a look at the filter section down here, which gets really impressive. So inside of the type, we have 5 categories, and inside of each category, we have a lot of different filter models. We actually have 56 different filter models inside of Avenger, and some of them get pretty crazy and they sound pretty amazing. We also have different kinds of drive. We have oversample drive, we have a kind of a comb filtered drive as well. And again, just like up here on the amp envelopes, when we touch and start moving these parameters, we get to see a visual representation of everything that's going on inside of the envelope, as well as the sub function when we're adjusting. So you might be wondering at this point what all these little red dots mean, and that essentially means that this can act as a modulation source in order to make something else move throughout time. And that's simply done by clicking, dragging, and then bringing it over. And if you can modulate it, it will tell you. On the knobs, it will actually show a ring, and then on the sliders, it will show that. There is one important difference between dragging it to a knob and then dragging it to an actual box. When you drag it to the knob, you're going to see this little red triangle right here. This is your ability to adjust how much of that modulation is happening. You should also be seeing it down here in the mod matrix while we're adjusting the amount using this little triangle. You're going to see that changing down there on the mod matrix. Now, when you bring this modulation source over to, let's say, a slider, you don't have the little triangle and the ability to do it there. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to change it down here in the mod matrix. You won't get visual feedback right here with a little red line, only when you're doing it with the knobs. But anytime you see a little red circle, that means you can simply drop and drag this modulation. But there are plenty of other ways to add modulation, which we are going to cover when we come down here into the matrix. So back to the filters up here. They are very impressive. They sound really good. It takes a little bit of time to go through and listen to all of them, but I guarantee you can find anything you need inside of this massive menu of 56 different kinds of filters. Now, moving down from that, we have Shaper. And as we mentioned before, the Shaper is essentially a distortion on an oscillator level. And again, we have up to 5 different shapers. Now, the cool thing about the Shaper is it does give us kind of a visual graphic representation of what's happening. So we can see it just shows us a standard sine wave, but as we start to tweak it, it's going to start to show us what exactly is happening to that sine wave based on how much we're tweaking the knob. And again, gray box above it means that there's some sort of drop down, so we have all these different kinds of oscillator distortion. The devil one looks like a little devil horns right there, but it doesn't just stop there. So let's actually just initiate a patch real quick. So we just have a standard sine wave, and let's go ahead and add a little bit of the devil distortion to it. And we're starting to hear that change, but we also have 2 bands that we can sweep through that distortion. So you can see that we're starting to get some really unique sound design. We can do a second band as well. And we can also reduce the distortion in certain parts. And we can even split it where this band is going to be panned far left and this band is going to be panned far right. And you can hear that if we add some modulation to this, just with a single saw oscillator and this shaper, we're able to get some really aggressive sounds, which are awesome. And again, we have 5 of those. So just a quick recap, these 3 sections right here, the amp envelope, filter envelope, and the shaper envelope, can each have up to 5 different ones. And when we start adding multiple ones, if we wanted a specific oscillator to go to a specific one of these, we would just use the drop down right here to change it. And then that is now rerouted through that instance that we just populated. So we have a massive amount of ways to not only create the sound, but also to shape them over here. And we can take it one step further with a massive amount of effects. And then we're going to come over and get into all the different ways we can add modulation to all the stuff that's going on up here. Let's check out these effects. So essentially inside of the effects section right here, each individual effect slot can have 8 different effects. You can move them around in order, but these just aren't your standard effects. Vengeance makes a production suite with a whole bunch of amazing effects, and they've actually put those effects right inside of Avenger. They're not stripped down versions, they are full-blown versions of the plugins that they sell individually. And we can have up to 4 different effect outputs. So if we look right up here inside of our routing for the oscillator, we can see that now we can route this oscillator to any one of these 4 different stacks of 8. We also have the send effects like we looked at earlier, but then we also have the master effects. And again, with each one of these down here at the bottom, we have these 3 lines which give us the ability to go through presets, which are all really incredible presets. So we can come in and add, let's say, this stack right here, and then come over to this guy and add its own stack on effect number 2. And this is a really good way to start getting used to how all these effects sound inside of Avenger and how they all work. Let's just take a brief look at what kind of effects you can find inside of Avenger. So we have a whole bunch of different reverbs and delays and a couple of new ones that just came out with version 2.0. Here in Quantum Effects, now we have up to 3 different delays that can be triggered off of one instance. We also have a brand new reverb called Rootverb, and this is absolutely my favorite reverb because it has Abyss, which is essentially kind of like a black hole setting, and it goes on forever. You can just hear that reverb tail going on forever and ever, and it sounds amazing. I love it. So those are 2 new effects that are found inside of version 2.0, but there are so many effects inside of here. That's going to be a whole nother separate video going over all these, but just a couple of highlights. There's a bunch of reverbs, a bunch of delays, your standard, like your different flangers and choruses, vintage versions of the flanger and the chorus, a whole bunch of really great distortion, and then also a whole bunch of different dynamics, including essentially just their version of the LFO tool that you can throw in there and make a custom shape to use it as ducking or pumping, whatever you want. And also new in version 2.0 is having a envelope follower as a mod source. So as an example, what you could do with this is you could, let's say, take a kick drum that is pulsing on a 1, 2, 3, 4, route that out to here, and then have that be the trigger to, let's say, duck the volume of an oscillator. And essentially, you just created internal side chaining inside of Avenger, which is pretty amazing, and we'll have that in a future video. It's just to cover everything inside of one video would make this video extremely long, so this is more of a general overview, highlight reel of what makes Avenger so powerful. So, just a quick review on this effects section. We have 4 different effect stacks, each one with 8 different slots. a full send effects section with 8 different slots, and a master effects section with 8 different slots. And these effects are just fantastic. Everywhere from the EQ to the compressors, they sound amazing. Again, these aren't just stripped back versions shoved into the synth. These are the full-blown versions that you would find in the Vengeance Producer Suite. And that's actually why it's called VPS Avenger, because it's Vengeance Producer Suite Avenger. So you get so many different effects in here. That's going to be a whole separate video, as we said earlier, but it's really impressive. Okay, now I want to jump over to the center section because there's so much stuff loaded in here. So let's start off with the ARP, because the ARP is one of my favorite parts of Avenger. It should essentially just be called a full-on sequencer instead of an ARP, because it can do pretty much anything you can do inside of a DAW. So we have this bass sound loaded up, and the first thing we want to do is route this bass sound into the ARP. So up here in our routing, it's ARP 1. We're going to click on that, meaning that now when I trigger a note, that note is triggered by the ARP here. Now, a couple of things inside of the ARP. We have these little lines right here in the upper right, which means our favorite. We have presets that we can start off with and play around with. There's even a whole section for bass lines, so let's just check out a couple. We can just hit the little arrow to go through it. So what's happening here is these notes are being triggered based on whatever root note I hit on the keyboard. And they're jumping around between octaves. So essentially each one of these is a different octave. So if we throw this guy way up top, if we throw it down to where it was, and then down here at the bottom, each one of these are actual steps. So if we wanted to add a little melodic variation to this, we could go up, let's say, 5 steps there. This one we're going to go up 9 steps. And you can only go up to 11 because, again, to move the whole octave, you would just simply move this. But now we have a little melodic variation. But let's say I wanted to add a little bit of rhythmic variation. This is where a new feature inside of version 2.0 comes in, and that is ratcheting, which is this little drop-down menu right here. So these are all the different ratchets that we can add. And on this first note, I'm just going to add a little bit of ratchet. So let's say 5 default. Now, the cool thing about this ratcheting is that as we change the length of the note, it changes the speed of the ratchet to accommodate. So you have all these different options down here, but it even goes deeper than that. If we right-click on here, now we have the ability to draw in our own different velocities for each one of those ratchets, as well as do note offsets. This is pretty crazy. So we can go all the way up to, let's say, 12, 9, 7, 5, down to 0. And now we're going to hear it just do this pitch down ratchet. So you can go in and customize the ratchets exactly how you want it via velocity and via pitch, and even change the duration based on the duration of the note. So as you can see, you can pretty much do whatever you want with this ratcheting feature inside of the ARP. Now, another new feature that I'm really excited about in version 2.0 is the randomization. So if we click on this little dice right here, it's going to pull up the randomize section. And this allows us to do a whole bunch of different randomization to this pattern. So if we select all, essentially what we're going to do when we roll the dice is we're going to have different notes with different blocks of silence, different lengths of notes, different octaves, just everything, different ratchets, everything is going to be randomized. So let's roll the dice. Keep rolling the dice and coming up with new ideas. But let's say I'm working in a specific scale for this song. If I right click where it says chromatic and then scroll down, I can lock in this randomization to any of these different scales and modes right here. So let's go with melodic minor and then roll the dice. and everything is going to be snapping to this melodic minor. So then down here at the bottom, we have the ability to add even more randomization going on, such as note, silent, length, octave, velocity, and this is the note distribution, silence distribution, length distribution. So as you can see with the randomization, you can get very random, but it also maintains a musical quality because we can have it locked to certain scales and certain modes right here, and we can affect only specific things that we want when we're rolling the dice, and we can even take it one step further and adjust the distribution of all the different parameters right here. So it is randomized, but it is a lot more musical than some of the other randomization that I've used in others since. But let's go back up to the top. Let's deactivate random. And there's a couple of other things we can do as well. We can turn this into chords right here. We can adjust the strum, which is really cool. So let's get rid of some of these right here. So we just have this initial chord at the beginning. And if we hover over this and click into strum edit, we then have the ability to adjust how much strum is happening on each one of these chords. So let's say we wanted to strum this one as well here. We're just going to come over and drag it up. Let's get rid of these. And those are strums going up. We could also strum down. We can also change what chord we're actually playing here. So really quickly, now we have a completely different chord. And again, we're going to have more videos coming up where we do a deep dive into all the functions inside of this ARP. But that's just a brief overview to show you how powerful it is. And if you have Avenger right now, I urge you to go in and just start playing around with some of these presets to see exactly what this ARP is capable of. Now, we've already talked about the drum sequencer, and then we have the step sequencer. The step sequencer essentially acts as like a trance gate. And as you can see, we just turned it on right up here. And again, like everything else inside of Avenger, we have a preset menu, so get in there and play around with all these different presets. And again, you have up to 8 of these different step sequencers. And you don't just have to use them to routing the oscillators out into, again, since it has the little red dot, you could, let's say, use this oscillator to modulate the filter. Pulling up the amount. Let's go through some different shapes. All right, so that's a step sequencer. Again, we're going to go into all the details of everything down here in future videos, but just to show you how powerful it is. And it's the same with the pitch envelope. Here we can assign this to pretty much anything we want to add movement and add modulation. I typically would use these a lot of times to add some attack with using the pitch spike at the beginning, just to add a little bit of pop at the beginning of a sound. But again, you can come in here and you can get crazy. And again, we have all these different presets. So by loading this up, you can start to see some of the different shapes and some of the different abilities of this pitch in order to get some really crazy ideas going on, whether you're using this to adjust the pitch of the oscillator or just as a mod source. And again, we have 8 of these different pitch envelopes. Moving over to the mod envelope, again, we have 8 different mod envelopes. And going through some of these presets, you can see exactly how crazy you can get with some of these shapes and using them as different modulation sources. So let's go ahead and turn off the step sequencer, and then let's say route this modulation envelope over to this filter. And remember, we got to turn up the amount. Let's go through some of these shapes. And again, any one of these shapes, we can tweak it however we want. We can add more nodes, draw it in, customize it, delete nodes if we don't want to. We can flip the whole envelope over. We can reverse the envelope, and we can reset the envelope. You can do pretty much whatever you want with these envelopes and get some insane movement going on with all the different parameters inside here. And again, you can take these and assign them pretty much to anything that highlights when you hover over it. And that is also making sure that you don't forget that you can actually automate pretty much anything inside of all of these different effects over here. So we could take this modulation envelope 1 and drag it onto the parameters of the reverb. We could drag it onto the amount, go into the delay. We could drag it on in over here. So as you can see, it's pretty unlimited to what you can modulate inside of Avenger. You can pretty much modulate anything you want using this drop and drag system or this mod matrix and the LFOs that we're about to get to. And then moving over from the mod envelope, we have the mixer. So inside of the mixer, we have a volume and a pan for each one of the oscillators right here. And then we also have a full-on drum mixer where we can adjust the independent volume of each one of these drums. And if you're using Avenger to route multiple different outs inside of your DAW, this is where you'd click and you'd actually assign the drum sounds to their auxiliary outputs. So inside of your DAW, you can have an independent output for each one of these drums and use the effects from your DAW. We're going to cover that in a future video, but this is where you would do that routing. It is the drum section inside of the mixer tab. And then moving over from that, we have our zones, which are pretty self-explanatory. It's each individual oscillator, however many you have. Let's say if we add another one, we're going to see it populate down here. And you can say when the oscillator is going to be triggered based on what key range is assigned to it. And then we have the system setting here where we looked at before, turning on the show tooltips. But one really cool thing is if you're curious where all your content is, just go on to content and you can see the direct file path right here. Also with MIDI, if you're going to be mapping Avenger to any sort of external gear, this is where you do the MIDI mapping and see all your MIDI mapping inside of here. So you could map it to a controller one time, and then every time you open it up, it's already pre-mapped. And although that's a very broad overview, I hope you can see how much power you have in just these different sections inside of the center piece of Avenger. Now let's just jump over to the right and look at the LFOs and the modulation. So like everything else, we have 5 different LFOs. We can click on those, and by right clicking we have all these different shapes right here. But we also have the ability to make 3 of our own custom shapes. We can just click and add nodes in order to draw our shapes, and then clicking and bending the different curves. And again, we can use these LFOs and modulate anything we want simply by dropping and dragging them. But let's say we wanted to modulate, let's say LFO 2 by LFO 1. How would we do that? Because we can only see one LFO at a time. Well, the cool thing is if we just hold it over LFO 2 for a little bit, it will actually switch and let us drop that in right there. But if we want to see an overview of everything that's going on inside of our modulation matrix, we just click on Mod Matrix. Now, there's a lot going on already, and it'd be great if there was an easier way to see this, which there is. By clicking this guy, we expand to a larger screen. We can also collapse to shorten everything up and expand it with this guy right here. We can add in a new modulation source. Let's say we didn't want to do a drop and a drag. We can just click this, select where we want it come. Let's say we want to come it from the step sequencer 1. It will generate that down at the bottom here, and then we can select what target we want it to go to. Let's say we want to go to the snare and the snare 2 spike. Now we just routed that without having to do any dropping and dragging. And as you can see, you can pretty much modulate anything from anything inside of Avenger. You also have a shape right here, and by clicking on it, it shows you a bigger version. You can add different nodes, again, to this shape to adjust how the modulation is working. I hope you're starting to see that everything inside of Avenger is modulatable, customizable. There's presets for everything, and it's just The possibilities seem to be truly endless the way that they've designed this synth. But let's go to the very last but not least section down here in the lower right corner, which are the macros. Now, in the older version, we essentially had 3 knobs and 2 buttons that we could custom assign to any number of parameters. But in version 2.0, another really cool thing we can do is we can add up to 4 pages of macros, which means now we have 12 macro knobs and 8 macro buttons. You can pretty much create any sort of scenario that you want. And again, all you're going to have to do is, let's say, just drag it to multiple different areas right here. And you can see down here in the matrix, it's just stacking up our different automations. And with this one knob, we are going to be able to turn all the other knobs exactly how we want. We can even turn them in the opposite direction by going negative. And now we're starting to see just how complex we can get inside of Avenger to pretty much build and create anything we want. And you can go and custom name all these different macro knobs and the buttons, and it will show up reflected right here with a name just after macro knob number 10, whatever name we put in there. Now, to go into the detail of each one of these sections, this video would end up being extremely long. So this was just, again, a broad overview of the power inside of Avenger. And in future episodes, we're going to do deep dives into each one of these individual sections. All right, I hope that overview helped you see not only how robust Avenger is, but also helped to demystify a little bit when you're looking at the plugin, because at the start it may be a little overwhelming, but after you used it maybe just in one session for a couple hours, it's actually really intuitive and you can find yourself getting around the interface very quick and very easily. And on top of that, the fact that you have 8 oscillators, a drum oscillator, so many mod envelopes, 5 different pitch envelopes, different amp envelopes, different filter envelopes. There's so much stuff going on inside of this plugin. I've really not found a situation where I've been wanting it to provide anything more than it already does. And typically I'm only using about 20 or 30% of the capabilities of the plugin. So if you have a favorite synth, please leave a comment down below on what your one and only synth would be. I'm really curious to see what the general consensus is there out there amongst the viewers. That's the rules though. If you had to pick one and only synth, you're stuck on a desert island, which synth would you pick? That being said, if you want to help support the channel, there is a Zounds link down below. A little tiny bit of any purchase you make through that link comes back to the channel, helps us keep the light on and the electricity flowing. This is Create, Educate, and Inspire. My name is Stu. We enjoy bringing you this content, and if you enjoy it too, remember to subscribe down below. And how we always sign off on this channel, thanks for your time. Thanks for your attention. Now go grab your favorite virtual synth, whether it's Avenger or Falcon, which, if you like Falcon, explain it to me, because I can't get the whole tree structure spreadsheet thing going on there. But leave a comment down below if that's your favorite one. Grab whatever synth you want and go make something cool.